Imagine a practice so painful it broke bones, yet so persistent it lasted 1,000 years. Foot binding, the Chinese tradition of tightly wrapping young girls' feet to reshape them, endured from the 10th century until the early 20th century. Why did generations of women endure this agony, and what kept this tradition alive through dynasties and revolutions? The story begins in the 10th century, during China's Song Dynasty. According to legend, a court dancer named Yao Niang bound her feet to perform a lotus dance for the emperor. Her tiny, curved feet were said to resemble crescent moons, captivating the imperial court. But historical evidence suggests foot binding may have emerged from multiple sources. Initially, foot binding was an elite practice among court women and wealthy families. The ideal foot, called the golden lotus was only 3 inches long, about the size of a child's hand. This wasn't merely about aesthetics. It represented refinement, discipline, and social status that separated the elite from commoners. The binding process began between ages 4 and 7, when bones were still malleable. A girl's feet were soaked in warm water, then her toes, except the big toe, were broken and bent under the sole. The arch was forcibly broken, and the foot was wrapped tightly with long cloth bands. The initial binding was excruciating, with girls often screaming through the night. Over 2 years, the bindings were tightened regularly, preventing normal growth. The goal was to create a foot shaped like a crescent moon or lotus bud, completely unnatural but culturally prized. Why would parents subject their daughters to this pain? In traditional Chinese society, foot binding became essential for marriage. A woman with bound feet, especially golden lotuses commanded higher bride prices and married into better families. It was an investment in a daughter's future. Beyond marriage prospects, foot binding represented Confucian ideals of female virtue. Small feet symbolized modesty, restraint, and obedience, qualities prized in women. The practice literally kept women at home, as walking any distance was painful and difficult. By the Ming Dynasty, foot binding had spread from elites to the middle classes. Even peasant families bound their daughters' feet, hoping to marry them upward. The practice became so widespread that unbound feet were seen as shameful, a mark of poverty or ethnic minority status. The Qing Dynasty saw foot binding reach its peak, despite the ruling Manchu ethnicity forbidding it among their own women. Han Chinese women continued the practice as a marker of ethnic identity and cultural tradition. Even as China faced Western imperialism, foot binding persisted. The physical consequences were devastating. Women with bound feet suffered chronic pain, infections, and difficulty walking. Their feet required daily care, washing, applying medicinal powders, and rewrapping. Many developed osteoporosis and arthritis as they aged. Yet women themselves often became enforcers of the tradition. Mothers bound their daughters' feet, grandmothers inspected the results. This intergenerational transmission created a powerful cultural inertia. Women who had suffered saw no alternative for their daughters. Eroticization played a crucial role in foot binding's persistence. Bound feet became fetishized. Men wrote poems about lotus hooks and fragrant lotuses The tiny shoes, embroidered with erotic symbols, became objects of desire. This sexual dimension gave the practice powerful cultural staying power. The first serious challenges came in the 19th century. Christian missionaries condemned foot binding as barbaric. Chinese reformers, influenced by Western ideas, began questioning traditional practices. But change was slow. Foot binding was deeply woven into social fabric. The late Qing dynasty saw organized anti-foot binding societies emerge. Reformers like Kang Yaowei argued that foot binding weakened China by crippling half its population. They saw unbound feet as necessary for a modern, strong nation that could resist Western imperialism. After the 1911 revolution that ended imperial rule, the new Republic of China officially banned foot binding. but enforcement was weak in rural areas. The practice continued because social attitudes hadn't changed. Families still feared their daughters would be unmarriageable. The May 4th movement of 1919 brought intellectual attacks on foot binding as symbolic of China's backwardness. Progressive writers like Lu Xun criticized the practice in their works. Urban, educated women began leaving their feet unbound as a statement of modernity. Communist revolutionaries made ending foot binding a priority. They organized /foot inspection teams in liberated areas, publicly shaming families who continued the practice. The communists framed foot binding as feudal oppression of women that must be eliminated. After the communist victory in 1949, foot binding was effectively eradicated through intense propaganda and social pressure. The last generation of women with bound feet were already adults. No new girls had their feet bound after the late 1940s. A thousand-year tradition finally ended. Today, only a handful of elderly women with bound feet remain, the last living witnesses to this practice. Their stories provide crucial first-hand accounts of why foot binding persisted despite the pain. They describe social pressure, family expectations, and the fear of being different. Scholars debate why foot binding lasted so long. Some emphasize patriarchal control, keeping women dependent and immobile. Others point to cultural inertia. Once established, traditions resist change. Economic factors mattered too. Foot binding affected marriage markets and social mobility. Foot binding wasn't unique in world history. Corsets in Europe, neck rings in Africa, and other body modifications show how cultures shape ideals of beauty. But foot binding was exceptionally persistent, surviving dynastic changes, foreign invasions, and modernization efforts. The legacy of foot binding continues in subtle ways. Some argue China's emphasis on female appearance today echoes older beauty standards. Others see foot binding as a cautionary tale about how traditions can persist long after their original purpose disappears. Understanding foot binding requires looking beyond simple explanations of oppression. Women weren't just victims, they were active participants who believed they were doing what was best for their daughters. This complexity explains why change was so difficult. Foot binding's thousand-year history reveals how cultural practices become self-perpetuating. Once established, they create their own logic, economic, social, and psychological. Changing them requires more than laws. It requires transforming deep-seated beliefs about beauty, virtue, and success. The end of foot binding came through multiple forces: Western influence, nationalist reform, revolutionary ideology, and changing economics. No single factor could have ended it. It took a perfect storm of social transformation to break a millennium-old tradition. Today, lotus shoes and foot-binding artifacts are collected in museums. They serve as reminders of a painful past and the human capacity to endure and eventually reject harmful traditions. These objects tell stories of suffering, but also of resilience and change. Foot binding raises profound questions about beauty standards across cultures. What practices do we accept today that future generations might see as cruel or irrational? How do we distinguish cultural tradition from harmful practice? These questions remain relevant globally. The women who endured foot binding left no written records of their pain. Their stories come to us through artifacts, photographs, and the few elderly survivors. Listening to these silent voices helps us understand not just Chinese history, but human nature itself. Foot binding's persistence teaches us about cultural resilience, how practices survive not because they're rational, but because they're embedded in social systems. Changing such systems requires addressing not just the practice itself, but the entire web of beliefs supporting it. As we look back on foot binding's thousand-year history, we see a mirror reflecting human society's capacity for both cruelty and change. The practice shows how traditions can outlive their original purposes and how difficult, but possible, social transformation can be. The story of foot binding isn't just Chinese history, it's human history. It reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that traditions have power, and that changing deeply rooted practices requires understanding their complex social foundations. The last lotus shoes may be in museums, but their lessons remain alive.